Good evening. Welcome to our Martin Luther King Jr. Day event sponsored by the Center for African and African American Studies and the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning. I'm Anthony Pinn, the Agnes, Cullen, Arnold Distinguished Professor of Humanities and the director of both of the sponsoring centers. I'm joined this evening by Dr. Daniel Domingues, who is Associate Professor of History and Director of Undergraduate Studies for the Center for African and African American Studies. Dr. Domingues will moderate our brief Q&A as well as provide closing comments and announcements. As a reminder, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to get your questions to Dr. Domingues. Now, it's my honor to introduce our lecturer for this special day and our first event of the spring semester, Dr. Robert Michael Franklin, Jr. Dr. Franklin is the James T. and Berta R. Laney Professor in Moral Leadership at Emory University, where he also serves as a senior advisor to the university president. Dr. Franklin graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Morehouse College with a degree in political science and religion, and earned a Master of Divinity degree from Harvard Divinity School. He continued his education at the University of Chicago, earning a PhD in ethics and society and religion and the social sciences. He is the recipient of 8 honorary degrees in recognition of his outstanding contributions to both the academy and the larger society. Dr. Franklin is the author of numerous books, including Moral Leadership, Integrity, Courage, Imagination, and Crisis in the Village, Restoring Hope in African American Communities. In addition, he has worked with 3 US presidents on various initiatives: President Clinton's One America initiative, President Bush's Faith-Based Advisory Committee, and President Obama's My Brother's Keeper initiative. Dr. Franklin is a board member of the Centers for Disease Control Foundation and the Princeton Theological Seminary. He is active in a variety of organizations, including the Atlanta Falcons Community Advisory Board and the CNN Dialogues Advisory Committee. In 2019, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms invited him to serve on the mayor's task force for the promotion of public trust. This introduction doesn't serve to capture the full range of Dr. Franklin's achievements, but it provides a sense of why it is such a great honor to have him with us this evening. Friends, please join me in welcoming to Rice, Dr. Robert Franklin.
Well, thank you a great deal, Professor Pinn. What an honor it is to be with you and many colleagues who gather this evening. Welcome to all. And I'd like to especially thank the president, the board, leadership of Rice University, the faculty, staff, and students, all of the alumni, and certainly to the extraordinary team in the Center for African and African American Studies and the Center for Engaged Research and Collaborative Learning. Thank you all for all that you do. I will just share this word of personal privilege. Professor Pinn was once my student. I am now his student, but I remember watching him in class and engaging. He was quite extraordinary, and I knew there were great things ahead. And so it's a real thrill for me as a teacher to observe your extraordinary progress, wonderful research, the growing corpus of published writings and your books that I have used with my own students. So thank you, Professor Pinn, and thank you so much for this generous invitation. Regrettably, we are doing this lecture tonight virtually. I'm glad we're able to do it. I wish I could be in Houston with you and many of you who gather there, because I have special attachments to that great city. My wife, Dr. Cheryl Franklin, who practices medicine in Atlanta, is a native of Houston and Kashmir High School alumna. But my dear mother-in-law, Gladys Goffney, is there. She's an extraordinary community leader, church leader, practicing attorney. And so, Professor Pinn, if I was there with you, I would twist your arm to take me out to my favorite restaurant in Houston, of which I have many. In any case, you owe me on that. Again, a real pleasure to have you all here. And as we bring an end to what has been a terrific Martin Luther King holiday weekend, and one where there is still a lot of remembrance and affection being shared, but also heightened concern about the state of our democracy. That's certainly where Dr. King was at the end of his life, and a concern with the Poor People's Campaign and so on. So we'll talk a little about that. I would like to share, and I also want to thank Dr. Domingues for your work and our conversation to come. I do note that my point of view on this topic is perhaps a bit unusual and unique. I had the privilege, I never met Dr. King during his life, but I did have the privilege of getting to know all of his family, Daddy King, as we called him, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Sr., and then Mrs. King, Alberta King, who played the organ at Ebenezer Baptist Church. I attended Morehouse College, and so I was a part of the kind of Morehouse ethos that nurtured young Martin Luther King and his sister and brother. And then I had the privilege of serving on the Board of Trustees as a student member of the board. And I point that out because this was a new development, that students served on the Board of Trustees, in part because of student protests just a couple of years earlier, in fact, after Dr. King's assassination in 1968. Some of you will know, but perhaps not all of you know, that the actor Samuel L. Jackson was part of a student protest at Morehouse that locked in the Board of Trustees. One of the demands, in addition to more focus academically and in the curriculum on African and African American studies, it was precisely to add members, student members, to the Board of Trustees. And I was very privileged to be elected as a sophomore member. There were 3 students. And I only mention that because I hadn't thought about this in some time until I was preparing for this, this occasion. And I realized I had the privilege as a, I guess, 18-year-old student sitting there in the room with Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, who was the recently retired president of Morehouse College. His final year was 1967, and you all will recall that President Mays was called back to campus on April 9th, 1968, 5 days after Martin King's assassination. He delivered the eulogy that day. In fact, it was my first time laying eyes on him watching television from Chicago, where I was reared. In any case, here I was with Dr. Benjamin Mays and with Daddy King, who was also on the board. And the conversations there were absolutely fascinating. I mean, this was basically 2.5, 3 years after Dr. King's assassination. And it was still the kind of a grief in the air and a reckoning with the future, and to be a conversation partner with those 2 extraordinary mentors and leaders was quite rich. So it informs much of what I think about. And then later, of course, serving as president of Morehouse gave me even keener insight into what I'll allude to momentarily, the role of strong institutions with strong cultures that ultimately can produce, no guarantee, but can produce strong leaders, strong citizens. And I think that's one of the points I'd like to make this evening. I'm going to go right to our PowerPoint presentation because I'd like to make that a part of the dialogue as we move forward here. And I hope you'll be able to see this clearly. I am intrigued by this topic of moral leadership, and I have chosen to focus there tonight as we think about Dr. King and the call for moral leadership in turbulent times. At the outset, I would point out that our focus and goal, I think, this evening is really to focus on King's impact as a moral leader. So not simply what he said and the things he did. You'll notice that my focus is also to step back and ask about impact of leadership, and to stimulate conversation about the nature of moral leadership and why we need more of it now. I believe that moral leadership is the most important determinant of a nation's ethos and of every institution's culture. Let me just say that, and I've just published a little essay on moral leadership, a book-length piece. It's titled Moral Leadership. I believe that moral leaders are people with virtue, of people with good traits, who serve the common good while seeking to invite others to join the movement. And so they are themselves people who are striving to live and become better people, good people, but they're engaged in activity aimed at serving the common good, not just people in their own communities or constituencies or in parochially defined denominations, what have you, the common good. And then finally, that third element of my definition is they invite others to join. That's sort of the leadership move, if you will. I begin by reminding us that leaders are products of contexts. And here you'll see this notion that moral leaders are formed in these rich milieus. In the case of King, I put these three pictures here to highlight the role of family, of the school, of the house of worship or church in this case. And of course, there are many other mediating institutions, as Peter Berger talked about that. I've also been intrigued by the French, now deceased French critical sociologist and public intellectual Pierre Bourdieu, who talked about habitus, structuring structure, which organizes practices and the perception of practices. That's a little abstract, but I'll unpack that a little when we look at what King's parents did in helping to form him as a healthy, whole human being, as a healthy African-American in a racist, Jim Crow-defined social culture in Atlanta, Georgia, in the South. So you see the picture of Daddy King, as we called him. He was a pastor of Ebenezer during Martin's young childhood. And then you see both his wife, who was Dr. King's mother, and Dr. King's grandmother there, his maternal grandmother. And then King is seated there in the picture with his sister, Willie Christine King, and his younger brother, A.D., Alfred Daniel King. And they were products of HBCUs, I should point out. Morehouse, Spelman, Hampton was an important institution for Dr. King's mother and other family members as well. Then the church. Some of you may have seen photographs of that church today as services were being shown, lots of news reports. And this, of course, is where young Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his early sermons, where he served as an assistant pastor. He was never the senior pastor of Ebenezer. That's why I always remind people, Ebenezer was really Daddy King's church, Daddy King's pulpit. But Martin is there as an assistant as he was helping to lead and build the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And of course, this is the site of his funeral in April of 1968. And then this is a photograph of Graves Hall, Morehouse College. Keep in mind, though, this notion of the habitus as a set of practices that help to organize and socialize people into a community and into the work and callings that they will later accept. So in terms of parents, this is what King wrote. Martin King wrote about his mother. My mother confronted the age-old problem of the Negro parent in America, how to explain discrimination and segregation to a small child. She taught me that I should feel a sense of somebodyness, but that on the other hand, I had to go out and face a system that stared me in the face every day saying, you are less than, you are not equal to. She told me about slavery and how it ended with the Civil War. She tried to explain the divided system of the South, the segregated schools, restaurants, theaters, housing, the white and colored signs on drinking fountains, waiting rooms, laboratories as a social condition rather than a natural order. I'd just like you to back up and think about that acknowledgement of what this mother was doing in the life of her children as an important ego-strengthening practice, but also I think a kind of right setting and the shaping of a moral compass that would enable him to understand the social world in which he was operating. It's no surprise to me that a few years later, King declares sociology as his undergraduate major. I suspect there's some undergraduates on this call tonight on this in this audience, and would love to hear from you later. But King decides he needs to better understand the way institutions, laws, policies operate. And so sociology was his major at Morehouse College. But then he goes on. She made it clear that she opposed this system, and I must never allow it to make me feel inferior. Then she said the words that almost every Negro hears before he can yet understand the injustice that makes them unnecessary. You are as good as anyone. At this time, Mother had no idea that the little boy in her arms would years later be involved in a struggle against the system she was speaking of. I just think this is kind of extraordinary, the shaping, nurturing, care, and discipline, almost a kind of cautionary preparation for the assaults and traumas that a Jim Crow system would inflict upon the egos of her children. And of course, we have versions of the talk today. I know a lot of America came to understand the life-giving and ego-protecting and body-protecting practices of Black parenting after the tragedies that faced Trayvon Martin and Tamir Rice as very young children, and so evocative of the challenges that young people like Emmett Till faced. And you recall, some of you have seen a televised version of how his mother prepared him, tried her best, giving him those orienting lessons, the compass, the social racial compass necessary for Black children in this country to understand their social system for the sake of survival. That's mom. Dad. I highlight the vulnerability and resilience of his father during a police stop, an interrogation, and you perhaps can read this. I remember riding with his father one day, and he accidentally drove past a stop sign. A policeman pulled up to the car and said, "All right, boy, pull over, let me see your license." My father instantly retorted, "Let me make it clear to you that you aren't talking to a boy. If you persist in referring to me as boy, I will be forced to act as if I don't hear a word you are saying." Martin recalls the policeman was so shocked in hearing a Negro talk to him so forthrightly that he didn't know how to respond. He nervously wrote the ticket and left the scene as quickly as possible. Think about the messaging coming from mom, you are somebody, be prepared. This is a social system that God didn't create and impose or establish. This is a social construction of exclusion, oppression, of an African American specific form of racism. So be aware of that, Martin. It's not you. It's not your fault, but you can be an agent to help transform this. And then what he observes in the presence of an authority figure who needs to be checked. And the fact that you could do that, and you could do that respectfully and survive, I think becomes a very significant factor in understanding King's later action as a public figure. Note the point about character formation here and I'm highlighting Aristotle's wisdom about the elements required for producing good people, good, healthy citizens, good children. There's some parents on this call and in this audience tonight. And Aristotle argued that three things were critical. First, moral knowledge, knowledge of what is good and bad, right and wrong, praiseworthy and blameworthy. That has to be taught. So the question arises, can you teach people to be good, to be moral? Well, I think Aristotle's response is yes, but, and this is certainly the element that the fundamental cognitive orienting of people to expectations about what is right and wrong can be taught. And then the question of moral will, and that is the desire to be good, the desire to do the right thing. Interesting how Aristotle really wants to focus on that needs to be encouraged, cultivated. One has a sense that there are many politicians or other leaders in our time who may know cognitively what is right and wrong, but the will to do the right thing, to tell the truth, to pay, one's fair share, to fulfill one's obligations is often not there. And one could argue that there's been a developmental challenge in that arena. And yet we can stimulate and affirm and reward and incentivize the desire to do good, to be good, to help others, to forgive those who harm you or wrong you, etc. But then this third element, moral knowledge, moral will, moral practice. One has to practice. Practice leads to a sense of learning one's own limitations, trial and error. And over time, back again to the Bourdieu's point about practice, one over time develops certain habits of doing the right thing. Habits that over time can become character. And that's the notion of moral character that is a result and built upon the habits informed by knowledge, will, and practice. So this is a photograph, one of my favorites, of Martin King seated in the chapel at Morehouse College, and a sense that that formation was happening through the early years, but also now as he reaches his teenage years. I transition to note that, and this makes the point I suggested earlier, that his observation that at the age of 15, I entered Morehouse. My father, my maternal grandfather had also attended. So Morehouse had 3 generations of Kings. Now I would add 4 generations because both of Dr. King and Mrs. Coretta Scott King's sons, Dexter and Martin III, are also Morehouse men. He says, I shall never forget the hardships that I had upon entering college. Look at this in terms of transparency and vulnerability. For though I had been one of the top students in high school, I was still reading at only an 8th grade level. I went to college from the 11th grade. I never went to the 12th grade and skipped another grade earlier. So I was a pretty young fellow at Morehouse. But this is my appreciation for this point about what are the characteristics of strong institutions? And as you think about institutions you are attached to, how would you assess them, evaluate them? How do you lead change in those institutions? He says, my days at college were exciting ones. There was a free atmosphere at Morehouse, and it was there that I had my first frank discussion on race. The professors were not caught up in the clutches of state funds and could teach what they wanted with academic freedom. The professors in the audience tonight will appreciate this notion of academic freedom. They encouraged us in a positive quest for a solution to racial ills. I realized that nobody there was afraid. That's a powerful observation. No one was afraid. Important people came in to discuss the race problem rationally with us. I know that this happens in all kinds of educational environments. It was certainly key to the genius of many, if not most, of America's liberal arts colleges, and certainly the case for America's 105 historically Black colleges and universities. And I can attest personally, that was very much the case at Morehouse, that our education was in some sense calibrated to have an impact on the discrepancies in our society, the presence of racism, violence, poverty, economic inequality. As we read texts in the humanities, even in the social sciences and to some extent the natural sciences, the discussion often went to how can this apply, have an impact on, create greater enlightenment about the challenges we will face when we leave this college. And so I immediately turned to a photograph of one of King's mentors, in part because he was such an important figure for many students in the Atlanta University Center. Howard Thurman, most of you will recognize that name, but for those who do not, I do urge you to become familiar with this extraordinary man, a philosopher, often characterized as a Christian mystic, a professor, a public intellectual, a pastor. He was dean of Marsh Chapel and hence a university chaplain at Boston University. And I think we recognize that that was the first appointment of an African-American to one of America's leading and major university chaplaincies back in 1953. What an extraordinary figure. I had the privilege of meeting Dr. Thurman on many occasions. There are friends who are on in our audience this evening who have written about Dr. Thurman. And this is the book, however, Jesus and the Disinherited, that was so important to young Martin King. And in fact, according to Andrew Young, the former mayor of the city, an aide to Dr. King, and the now deceased Reverend Wyatt T. Walker, who were both conversations with me over the years, they said Martin carried this little book in his briefcase more often than any other, always the Bible, but often this was the other book in his briefcase. And Thurman served, although he graduated from Morehouse in 1923, he returned years later, and he earned his Bachelor of Divinity from Rochester Theological Seminary. He returned to become a kind of theologian in residence at Morehouse and Spelman. He had a joint appointment teaching religion and philosophy, 1928 to 1931. So he encountered Thurman in the chapel at Morehouse, but he also encounters some classic texts, and that's what make this interesting. Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. I love his observation about, and we could talk about as the professor Vicki Crawford of Morehouse College and director of the Morehouse College Martin Luther King Papers at Morehouse College. She notes that King was an avid reader in addition to being a skilled and prolific writer. But I find it interesting that King begins to talk more and more about the books that impacted his mind. And I wonder for you tonight, what are the short list? How would you identify those books that change the way you think about the world? So he says, when I went to Morehouse as a freshman in '44, my concern for racial and economic justice was already substantial. During my student days, I read Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience for the first time. Here in this courageous New Englander's refusal to pay taxes and his choice of jail rather than support a war that would spread slavery's territory into Mexico, I made my first contact with the theory of nonviolent resistance. Fascinated by the idea of refusing to cooperate with an evil system, I was so deeply moved that I reread the work several times. And that notion of re-engaging important books, classic texts, is noteworthy, I think, in a liberal arts education. He said he became convinced that non-cooperation with evil is as much a moral obligation as is cooperation with good. No other person has been more eloquent and passionate in getting this idea across than Thoreau. As a result of his writings and personal witness, we are the heirs of a legacy of creative protest. The teachings of Thoreau came alive in our civil rights movement. Indeed, they're more alive than ever before. whether expressed in a sit-in at lunch counters, freedom ride in Mississippi, a peaceful protest in Albany, Georgia, a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. There are outgrowths of Thoreau's insistence that evil must be resisted and that no moral man or woman can patiently adjust to injustice. Part of what I'm suggesting here now, we've looked at the role of a mother and a father, preparing an ego, preparing the spirit, but also instilling and modeling an example of how you can resist with dignity, with respect, and ideally walk away from that encounter. I think King is internalizing these lessons as he goes along. And now in Thoreau's book, he's encountering as an undergrad an important guiding text. Then I had to add this for the benefit of those of you who are interested in King's own intellectual formation. I won't dwell on it, but this name Paul Tillich is an important figure in the life and thought of Martin Luther King, in part because King wrote his dissertation in part on the thought of Henry David Wyman and Paul Tillich. But he wrote to Tillich during the 1950s, mid-50s, as he's completing his dissertation. And as you see, he says, I'm a non-resident grad student at Boston University, writing a dissertation, a comparison of the conception of God and the thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman. I have been away from Boston for the past 4 months. However, I plan to be in Boston for about a week in the month of November from the 10th and so on. King is reaching out to an important intellectual mentor who was distant. And I want to just highlight this for the benefit of students who, perhaps you identify a thinker or artist or someone whom you admire. Let this be an example of how you can reach out. I mean, he never took a class with Tillich, but he wrote to Dr. Tillich, who was then teaching at Harvard. And then Tillich did reply. Your letter reached me at Aberdeen, Scotland, where I'm delivering the Gifford lectures. And he goes on to say, he wouldn't be there to meet him, but he was open and he even alerted King to, I'll be in Chicago, I'll be in New York. I would love to have a talk with you about your thesis. So just a little practice that I think is admirable and should be duplicated. Ultimately, Paul Tillich's little book, Love, Power, and Justice, was an important text for the making of King's mind. And if you read the letter from Birmingham jail that Martin Luther King wrote in 1963, you see it is drenched in not only the thought of Howard Thurman that we just looked at before, whom he knew personally and met at the Morehouse Chapel, but also Paul Tillich offered these categories: the nature of love in a larger social struggle for justice, the nature of power and how power can, indeed must be mobilized to resist evil, and the role of justice in that. And then at the time of Paul Tillich's untimely death, King offered this word of eulogy, not at the ceremony, but he wrote, he helped us to speak of God's action in history in terms which adequately express both the faith and the intellect of modern humans. Thoreau, Howard Thurman, Paul Tillich, Mahatma Gandhi. And this becomes an interesting element because he notes that when he finally was able to visit India, where Mahatma Gandhi had led a movement of decolonization and liberation, it's interesting that he and Coretta Scott King traveled there in 1959. Of course, Gandhi was already dead. In fact, Gandhi was assassinated in 1948, the same year Martin King graduated from Morehouse College. But when he traveled, he wrote back, and his letters, his travel log was published by Ebony magazine on Gandhi's impact. For a long time, I'd wanted to take a trip to India. Even as a child, the entire Orient had a strange fascination for me, elephants and tigers and so on. While the Montgomery boycott was going on, India's Gandhi was the guiding light of our technique of nonviolent social change. We spoke of him often. So as So as soon as our victory over bus segregation was won, some of my friends said, why don't you go to India and see for yourself what the Mahatma, whom you so admire, has wrought? I just find this kind of interesting. Now, the focus of modeling moral leadership, leading change in an unjust society shifted a bit from Thoreau's important personal example to now an example of leading social societal change, more than personal witness at the micro level. King also was in search of an example of how an entire society could be impacted, and Gandhi provided that. He goes on to reflect on that experience in a sermon delivered at his own church, Dexter Avenue, in 1959, as he talks about. And I won't go through this, but the second little bullet point here, I think you should underscore this, that Gandhi was able to achieve for his people independence from the domination of the British Empire without lifting one gun or without uttering one curse word. He did it in the spirit, with the spirit of Jesus Christ in his heart and the love of God. And this was all he had. He had no weapons, he had no army in terms of military might. And yet he was able to achieve independence from the largest empire in the history of the world without picking up a gun or without any ammunition. Just a powerful, I think, acknowledgement of Gandhi's impact. Well, let's transition as we move forward in thinking about the role of moral agents, of moral leaders, these intellectual role models for King, and there are many, many others that we could write about, talk about. But King notes that, that moral agents are people who live their lives according to a code of ethics and privately seek to be consistent with their deeply held values. On occasion, circumstances and their values may call them to act in extraordinary ways for the higher good, but then they go back to minding their own personal business, drawing a distinction here between the moral agent who steps up at a critical moment and then goes back to living their life. They don't necessarily think of themselves as a moral leader in an ongoing way. And so I would argue not all moral agents are leaders, but all moral leaders are first moral agents. I highlight this role of the whistleblower, so important in our society today. Often these are women or men who we don't really know or necessarily get to know as leaders, but some discrete act of moral agency, of truth-telling, of speaking truth to power, of revealing and exposing the lies of a corporation or government become turning points. And we see that, of course, in this wonderful issue of Time magazine almost 20 years ago, where these three leaders in the FBI, Invesco, or WorldCom, and Enron played an important role in leading change. I would argue that, and I talk about this in my book, that moral leaders are people who have the following characteristics: a lifetime project of practicing ideas like love, power, justice, empathy. In other words, they're lifelong students of the moral life, moral leaders. Secondly, they frame these ordinary everyday issues as moral issues. Look at the way, and we'll look at briefly at King's speech on at the bus boycott as it was getting launched that December 5th, 1955. Following Rosa Parks's example, moral agency and moral leadership. But the notion of framing a local drama, desegregating buses in Montgomery as this larger struggle of good versus evil, that was a part of King's genius. Third, that moral leaders strive to live exemplary lives. They strive, but they are undaunted by failure. They don't always achieve their high, noble ideals. And this is where I think King would observe, for instance, as Oscar Wilde did, that every saint has a past, every sinner has a future. Fourth, they invest in the next generation by building enduring institutions. In King's case, he founded organizations like the Montgomery Improvement Association, later the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But he was also heavily invested in HBCUs. At a certain point, Daddy King tried to talk young Martin King into becoming an HBCU president, even considered Morehouse, because he wanted him in a somewhat safer environment where he could continue to nurture the next generation in the message of social teachings and a social gospel. And then at the end, I argue that moral leaders live well, and they also die well. That notion of having a good death is a sense of being at peace with the principles you lived for. Look at Socrates, how the ancient Greek government forced him to drink the hemlock and executes him, how Jesus is executed. So often the good die young in these extraordinary ways, a good life and a good death. Let me turn toward the end here as we just highlight what King called the most decisive speech of his life. Many of you recall. Well, let's just read as he said, without manuscripts or notes, on that night when we were making a decision about what to do about the fact that Mrs. Rosa Parks had been arrested. He said, I told the story of what had happened to Mrs. Parks. Then I reviewed the long history of abuses and insults that Negro citizens had experienced on city buses. And he said, we are here this evening for serious business. We are here in a general sense because first and foremost, we are American citizens. We are determined to apply our citizenship to the fullness of its meaning. We are here also because of our love for democracy, because of our deep-seated belief that democracy transformed from thin paper to thick action is the greatest form of government on earth. This is what King is writing without manuscript, without notes. He only had 15 minutes to prepare what he said that night at Holt Street Baptist Church in December of 1955. And then he continued in language that those of us who know Thurman and Tillich and others, we hear, we can see it present here. We, the disinherited of this land. We who have been oppressed so long are tired of going through the long night of captivity. And now we're reaching out for the daybreak of freedom, justice, and equality. May I say to you, my friends, as I come to a close, that we must keep God in the forefront. He says, let us be Christian in all our actions. But I want to tell you this evening that it is not enough for us to talk about love. Love is one of the pivotal points of the Christian faith. There's another side called justice. So you clearly see in Tillich and love, power, and justice, and Thurman's talk about Jesus and the disinherited. He goes on in that speech, standing beside love is always justice. And we are only using the tools of justice. Not only are we using the tools of persuasion, but we've come to see that we've got to use the tools of coercion. Now we see this notion, tools of coercion, power. Not only is this a process of education, but it is also a process of legislation. That's an interesting shift too, isn't it? Process of education, one by one, change of mind, change of heart, but it's also a process of legislation. Law and policy must be a part of the transformation of an unjust society. And again, he goes on. I love his among his closing remarks, he notes right here in Montgomery, when the history books are written in the future. Now, how does this guy, the bus boycott had not yet started. He's already in the first night talking to the people, thousands of people assembled. When the history books are written in the future, somebody will have to say, there lived a race of people, of Black people, fleecy locks and Black complexion, of people who had the moral courage to stand up for their rights. And thereby, they injected a new meaning into the veins of history and of civilization. I'd argue that part of King's extraordinary achievement was this large frame of history that he brought to that moment. I'll just say briefly here that King had a rich theory of personal change, personal transformation. And in fact, I talked about this just yesterday in a sermon at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. King's favorite sermon, I believe, was titled Three Dimensions of a Complete Life, in which he talks about the need for attending to the length of your life, not in terms of longevity or days lived, but self-actualizing potential. The breadth, your engagement with others, social interdependence and connections, and social capital you build with others. Being a part of organizations that amplify your lone voice and vote, because now you've multiplied it. And then the height of life is the human quest for that transcendent relationship to the holy, for enlightenment, for a sense of purpose and meaning. So that's his theory of personal transformation. But then there's matched with his theory of social transformation. And I would suggest, and I'm going to conclude here momentarily, that King had, as he used the language of beloved community, an interpersonal view of the kind of society we should live in. He had a structural view, the kind of changes that needed to occur structurally. And this may be a fancy word, an eschatological view. That's a fancy term in the world of theology and theological studies for the study of the last times, the end of time, the end of life, eschaton. And so almost talked about by some of the old preachers, that in the by and by may not happen in our lifetime, but this will occur. And I would talk about three expressions of King's notion of beloved community. Beloved community 1.0 is the interpersonal, respect, cooperation, basic interracial, interfaith coalitions of conscience. Think of the March on Washington, MOW, March on Washington audience. It was diverse. That we can achieve that fairly easily. And we do it all the time. You go to a stadium when it's safe to be in a large stadium, or in other places where we are all sort of together for the same reason or purpose, to cheer the local Houston team or wherever you're from. That's this kind of beloved community 1.0, where there's basic respect. But beloved community 2.0, in my interpretation, requires that, back to that more than education, but also legislation. Law and policy, structures that foster human flourishing must come into play. So recall his wonderful words in the March on Washington in 1963. I want my kids to live in a nation, my 4 little children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. We'll be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. One could argue that that's something that could occur and may, depending on your interpretation, is occurring in our lifetime, happening now. One of the great fights now, and maybe we can talk about this in terms of voting rights, is what next with respect to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Law, policy, and social structures must change to create the architecture of beloved community 2.0. Demands a little more than 1.0, where we just kind of, that's the 1.0 is almost where we can sing Kumbaya and feel good, and then figure out how do we work on 2.0. That's the way I would like to conceptualize it. And then as I wrap up, beloved community, the end is reconciliation, King wrote. The end is redemption. The end is the creation of that sense of beloved community. And I illustrate those 3 examples, 1.0, 2.0, when President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act and a group of leaders and politicians are there. The 3.0 is that sense, the kind of world we want our children to live in. But finally, 1 minute, I'll just say these are the impacts that I think King had ultimately as a moral leader. A narrative impact on how we tell the story of America, providing a truer myth of exceptionalism. A political impact, he mobilized new voters, recruited new politicians. A policy impact in leaving the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, its impact on peace and with Vietnam. An economic impact, the role of economic justice and promoting boycotts. A social movement impact, students today and BLM and other movements, I think observed something in that civil rights movement that's worthy of imitation. Its impact on religion, its rhetoric, talking about social justice issues from the pulpit. And then finally, his culture impact, the way in which he engaged celebrities, the way he had an impact on gospel music, friendship with Aretha Franklin and Berry Gordy, and moved social gospel religion into the mainstream. Ultimately, we need moral leadership in our time, and Martin Luther King provides an example and a path for achieving it. Thank you all for listening.
Super. Thank you very much, Dr. Franklin. Thank you, Dr. Pinn. Hello, everyone. I'm Daniel Domingues, Associate Professor of History at Rice University and Director of Undergraduate Studies of the Center for African and African American Studies here at Rice as well. It is my pleasure to moderate the Q&A session. If you have a question, please send it to us by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Okay. We do have a few questions here trickling in, and some that were sent earlier during the moment of registration. Okay, so I'm gonna read one that we received earlier through registration. Dr. Franklin, what is the state of the Black nation about a leader or leaders in the current conflict of moral leadership in America right now?
What is the state? Could you just read the first part of that again, Professor?
Yes, yes. What is the state of the Black nation about a leader or leaders in the current conflict of moral leadership in America?
Well, I think there's always been alternative models of leadership and social change, and leaders engage and they essentially compete for the intellectual devotion of their listeners and followers. And I think that's certainly the case in the African-American community today. If I understand the crux of the question, there are younger leaders emerging. I think Professor Pinn and others have written about this. Eddie Glaude has written about this, Anthea Butler and others, that while I've talked tonight about a civil rights paradigm of moral leadership, that many younger leaders, leaders in BLM, Black Lives Matter, for instance, have a different kind of a perspective, sharing some elements of what I've talked about, but I think also diverging and crafting a different approach and not simply looking to a single leader or two or three, but rather the sense of organic grassroots leadership, shared governance of movements, which represents, I think, a very exciting model. But I think we saw something really, truly extraordinary during the 1950s and 60s to have the likes of Ella Baker as a grassroots organizer. She was the only woman who sat on the board of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that Dr. King founded and led. All the other leaders there were, Black preachers and businessmen. One woman. I think the movement and understanding leadership would be very different today in terms of more inclusive, gender inclusive leadership. And so I'll just stop there.
Super. Thank you very much. Another question that came in. How have you noticed views of Dr. King change throughout the years, and more specifically as a moral leader?
Yeah, the two things come to mind. One of them is, and again, there some of our, scholars and writers and pastors and other imams and rabbis who are in our audience tonight have talked and written about this more than I have. And that is a greater appreciation for just how radical Dr. King's vision and language were and are in our times. The way in which he talked about the threat, the corrosive effects of radical economic inequality. And so that's a vibrant conversation today. But to think that back in 1967, 68, Dr. King was leading with that message. And there was this interesting kind of evolution from the bus boycott focused on desegregating buses and a kind of race-specific analysis to where he ends up a few years later focused on the Vietnam War, the need for governments to practice peace, and a focus on the Poor People's Campaign, the very last movement in his life. Now, those elements of speaking out against violence and against poverty were there from the beginning. So it's not like he shifted and changed his mind. They were always present, but it's fascinating to me to see how his thought evolved and those were manifest. I think the other thing that strikes me in terms of the assessment of Dr. King is the way in which more conservative segments of America are appropriating the king that they prefer. It's almost like ordering from a menu. And they go right to the sermons, the sayings, the quotations. They construct a Martin Luther King that is more digestible, that is less threatening, and is essentially put in the service of their particular political and social agendas. I think that's where, we ought to have a conversation about that and the legitimacy of that kind of appropriation, some would characterize misappropriation of King. And again, I've heard some of that even today in the media, and no doubt we'll hear it later tonight and in the days ahead.
Yeah, a selective approach, perhaps.
Indeed.
Well, as a follow-up question here, if Dr. King was alive today, how would he handle the way our US Senate is designing the Equal Voting Act? In your opinion, of course.
Yeah. Of course, we are left to speculate, but I think that Dr. King would, as he said on many occasions, the right to vote is the foundation of a democracy, the foundation of citizenship, the foundation of authentic freedom. So while other measures are important, this one, voting, ability to run for office, ability to have one's vote properly counted, etc., governing is foundational and a pivot to all the other rights that we enjoy in society. And so I think that he would be speaking up, acting up, as Congressman John Lewis might say, getting into good trouble over this issue. This would not be an issue about which Dr. King would assume a posture of polite, genteel disagreement. I think he would challenge to the very core leaders who were seeking to dismantle the progress that this society has painstakingly wrought over the past 50 or 60 years. So I think that he would be protesting. He would be meeting with leaders. Recall the pictures, Dr. King led marches to highlight issues, but he also met with the President of the United States, met with members of Congress, and lobbied, argued, persuaded. Ultimately, as many of you know and have heard, a majority of senators supported the voting rights in that time. And that's one of the tragedies of our time, that there is such a clear partisan division on this question of voting rights as the fundamental right of citizenship in America. So Dr. King, I think, would really ensure that every American realizes the high stakes nature of this current debate.
Thank you very much, Dr. Franklin. We are, I'm afraid, running out of time. So I really appreciate your lecture and your comments. Please, folks, stand by for a few announcements. Again, thank you, Dr. Franklin. Dr. Robert Franklin Jr. is James T. and Berta R. Laney Professor in Moral Leadership and Senior Advisor to the President of Emory University. Next, in our lecture series, The Schools of Former Slaves and the Schools of Former Slave Owners, Religion, Race, and the Struggle for Black Education, with Dr. Marla Frederick on February 22nd, Learn more about our events at caaas.rice.edu/events. Special thanks to our co-sponsors, the School of Humanities, the School of Social Sciences. Thanks to the staff working behind the scenes, John Waterhouse and Naiva Agunobi. Thank you for joining us today. On behalf of CAAS, I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you very much again.